Margaret Sullivan never imagined that driving an ambulance would change her life forever. Born in a small farming town in Ohio, she had spent most of her 23 years helping her father with crops and caring for her younger siblings after their mother passed away from tuberculosis. When the war broke out in Europe, Margaret felt a calling she couldn't ignore. She wanted to help, but women weren't allowed in combat roles. The only way she could serve was as an ambulance driver for the Medical Corps. The training camp in Virginia was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Rows of white tents stretched across muddy fields, filled with young women from all walks of life. Some came from wealthy families in New York and Boston, others were farmers' daughters like herself. What united them was their determination to make a difference in a world torn apart by violence. Margaret quickly discovered that driving an ambulance required more than just knowing how to operate a vehicle. The instructors taught them basic medical care, how to stabilize wounded soldiers, and, most importantly, how to stay calm under pressure. The old Ford ambulances were temperamental machines that broke down frequently. Margaret spent hours learning every bolt and wire, understanding that a mechanical failure in the middle of a rescue could mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. During her final week of training, Margaret met Captain Robert Chun, a medical officer who would later become her supervisor overseas. He was a quiet man with gentle hands and tired eyes that had already seen too much suffering. Captain Chun pulled Margaret aside after watching her handle a particularly difficult training scenario. "You have something different, Sullivan," he told her. "Most drivers focus on getting from point A to point B as quickly as possible. You seem to understand that sometimes the journey is just as important as the destination." Margaret wasn't sure what he meant at the time, but his words stayed with her as she prepared for deployment. 3 weeks later, she found herself on a crowded transport ship crossing the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by hundreds of other volunteers heading toward an uncertain future in France. The crossing took 12 days, and Margaret spent most of that time below deck with the other women, sharing stories and fears about what awaited them. Sarah McKenzie, a nurse from Boston, became her closest friend during the voyage. Sarah had joined the Medical Corps after losing her fiancé in one of the first battles of the war. She carried his photograph everywhere and spoke about him as if he might still walk through the door at any moment. "I keep thinking I'll see him in one of the hospitals," Sarah confided to Margaret one evening as they stood on deck watching the sunset. "I know it's impossible, but sometimes hope is all we have." Margaret understood that feeling. She carried her own hopes and fears about the war. Her brother James had enlisted 6 months earlier and was somewhere in France with an infantry unit. She hoped that by serving as an ambulance driver, she might somehow help keep other families from experiencing the worry that kept her awake at night. When their ship finally docked in Le Havre, France, Margaret was struck by how different everything looked from the peaceful farmland of Ohio. The port city bore the scars of war everywhere. Buildings had chunks missing from their walls, windows were boarded up with wooden planks, and the streets were filled with military vehicles instead of the horse-drawn carts she was used to seeing back home. The American Medical Corps had established a base hospital about 20 miles from the front lines. It was housed in what had once been a prestigious boarding school for wealthy French children. The grand buildings with their high ceilings and ornate decorations now served as wards for wounded soldiers. The beautiful gardens had been converted into motor pools where ambulances and medical trucks were maintained and repaired. Margaret's first assignment was to work with Driver Unit 7, a team of 6 women responsible for transporting wounded soldiers from forward aid stations to the base hospital. Her fellow drivers came from different backgrounds but shared the same nervous excitement about finally beginning their real work. There was Betty Rodriguez from Texas, who could repair any engine with nothing but wire and determination. Linda Foster from Maine had studied nursing before becoming a driver and often provided medical assistance during transport. Anna Kowalski from Chicago spoke fluent French and German, making her invaluable when dealing with local civilians or captured enemy soldiers who needed medical attention. The unit's supervisor was Lieutenant Mary Patterson, a stern woman from military family who had been driving ambulances for 8 months. She gathered the new arrivals in what had once been the school's library, now converted into a briefing room with maps covering every wall. "Ladies," Lieutenant Patterson began, What you learned in training will keep you alive, but it won't prepare you for what you're about to see. The wounded men you'll be transporting aren't training dummies. They're real people with real families waiting for them back home. Some will die in your ambulance despite your best efforts. Others will recover completely. Your job is to give each one the best chance possible by getting them to medical care quickly and safely. She pointed to a map showing the network of roads between the front lines and the hospital. Red marks indicated areas where ambulances had come under enemy fire in recent weeks. Black marks showed where drivers had been killed or wounded. The enemy doesn't respect the Red Cross symbol as much as they should, Lieutenant Patterson continued. You'll be driving through active combat zones, often at night without headlights. German snipers have been targeting medical vehicles because they know it hurts our morale when drivers are killed. Margaret felt her stomach tighten as she studied the map. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. This wasn't going to be like driving country roads back home in Ohio. The next morning, Margaret made her first run to a forward aid station. She was paired with Linda Foster, the driver with nursing experience, who would serve as her mentor for the first few trips. Their ambulance was a converted Ford Model T with a canvas-covered back section that could hold 4 stretchers. The engine coughed and wheezed as they drove through the French countryside toward the sound of distant artillery. The trick, Linda explained as they navigated a road full of potholes created by shell explosions, is to drive fast enough to avoid enemy fire but slow enough that you don't kill your patients with a bumpy ride. It's harder than it sounds. They reached the aid station just as the sun was setting. The facility was nothing more than several large tents connected by covered walkways. Medical personnel in blood-stained aprons moved between the tents, triaging wounded soldiers who arrived in a steady stream from the front lines. Margaret's first patient was a young private from Pennsylvania who had been shot in the leg during a reconnaissance mission. He couldn't have been older than 19, with sandy hair and freckles that reminded her of her youngest brother back home. As they loaded him into the ambulance, he grabbed Margaret's hand. "Am I going to be okay?" he asked, his voice shaking with fear and pain. Margaret looked into his eyes and saw the same fear she had felt when her mother was dying. "You're going to be fine," she said firmly. "We're going to get you to the best doctors in France, and they're going to fix you up." During the drive back to the base hospital, the young soldier told Margaret about his family's farm in Pennsylvania and his plans to study engineering after the war. He talked about a girl named Mary who was waiting for him back home, and how he planned to marry her when he returned. Margaret listened to every word, understanding that sometimes conversation was the best medicine she could provide during the 40-minute journey. Over the following weeks, Margaret made dozens of trips between the aid stations and the base hospital. She transported soldiers with every imaginable type of wound: gunshot injuries, shell fragments, burns from gas attacks, and broken bones from explosions. Each patient had a story, a family, and dreams for the future. Margaret began to understand what Captain Chun had meant about the journey being as important as the destination. Some drives were routine, transporting soldiers with minor wounds who would recover quickly. Others were desperate races against time, carrying men who were bleeding internally or suffering from severe head injuries. Margaret learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a patient would survive the trip to the hospital. She developed techniques for keeping wounded soldiers conscious and talking during transport, knowing that conversation could help prevent them from going into shock. The work was physically exhausting and emotionally draining, but Margaret discovered she had a talent for staying calm under pressure. While other drivers sometimes panicked when faced with severely wounded patients, Margaret seemed to find an extra reserve of strength when it was needed most. She learned to start intravenous lines while driving over bumpy roads, to apply pressure bandages with one hand while steering with the other, and to provide reassurance to frightened soldiers even when she was scared herself. One evening in late October, Margaret was returning from a particularly difficult run when she noticed smoke rising from a wooded area about a mile off the main road. It was too far from the front lines to be caused by artillery, and there were no buildings in that direction that could be burning. Something about the situation didn't feel right. Against regulations, Margaret decided to investigate. She turned her empty ambulance off the main road and drove toward the smoke, navigating between trees and around fallen logs. As she got closer, she could hear voices calling for help in what sounded like English. Margaret parked her ambulance and continued on foot toward the source of the smoke. What she found would change everything about her role as an ambulance driver and set in motion events that would make her a legend among the medical corps. Hidden in a small clearing, she discovered the wreckage of a British reconnaissance aircraft that had been shot down earlier that day. The pilot was trapped in the cockpit, unconscious but breathing. His observer was lying nearby with a badly broken leg and severe burns on his arms from the fire that had consumed most of the plane's fabric covering. The injured observer looked up at Margaret with desperate eyes. "Thank God someone found us," he whispered. "We've been here since morning. My pilot friend is hurt badly, and I can't get him out of that cockpit." Margaret quickly assessed the situation. The pilot was unconscious, possibly from a head injury, and was trapped by twisted metal that had been bent around his legs during the crash. The observer had obvious fractures and burns but was alert and could communicate. Both men needed immediate medical attention, but getting them back to her ambulance would require more than just standard first aid. This wasn't part of her job description. Ambulance drivers were supposed to pick up patients from established aid stations, not conduct rescue operations in the middle of nowhere. But Margaret knew that if she followed regulations and went back to get help, both men would probably die before anyone could return to the crash site. For the first time since arriving in France, Margaret found herself in a situation where her training hadn't prepared her for what needed to be done. She would have to improvise, take risks, and make decisions that went far beyond her role as a simple ambulance driver. Standing in that forest clearing with two dying men depending on her, Margaret Sullivan was about to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed. The two ambulances left the base hospital just after midnight, driving without headlights through the French countryside. Margaret followed Betty Rodriguez's vehicle, trusting her partner's knowledge of the back roads that would take them around known German positions. The autumn night was cold and foggy, which provided excellent cover, but made navigation extremely difficult. They drove for nearly 2 hours before Betty signaled for a stop. Both drivers got out to check their position using a compass and map, keeping their voices to whispers in case enemy patrols were nearby. "We're about 3 miles from the farmhouse," Betty explained, pointing to their location on the map. "From here on, we'll be in territory that changes hands depending on which side has momentum on any given day. We need to be ready for anything." Margaret nodded, checking her medical supplies one more time. She had packed extra morphine, bandages, and surgical tools, knowing that the wounded soldiers might need treatment before they could be transported safely. She had also brought additional fuel, food, and water in case they were forced to take shelter and wait for better conditions. The final approach to the farmhouse required extreme caution. Both drivers turned off their engines and coasted down a small hill, using gravity and steering to navigate the last quarter mile in complete silence. Margaret could hear artillery fire in the distance and occasionally saw flares lighting up the sky, but the immediate area seemed quiet. The farmhouse sat in a small valley surrounded by fields that had once grown wheat but were now scarred by shell craters and abandoned trenches. Most of the building's roof was missing, destroyed by artillery fire weeks earlier, but the stone walls were still intact. Margaret could see dim light filtering through cracks in the boarded-up windows, indicating that the soldiers were indeed taking shelter inside. Betty Rodriguez approached the building first, using a coded knock that had been arranged through radio communications. After a tense moment, the door opened slightly, and a bearded soldier peered out cautiously. "Medical Corps," Betty whispered. "We're here to take you home." The door opened wider, and Margaret got her first look at the soldiers they had come to rescue. 7 men emerged from the farmhouse, 5 of them walking wounded, and 2 carried on makeshift stretchers. They were dirty, exhausted, and clearly grateful to see the ambulances. Margaret scanned the group quickly, looking for her brother James. She found him sitting against the wall inside the farmhouse, his left arm in a crude sling and a bandage wrapped around his forehead. When he saw her, his eyes widened in surprise and relief. "Maggie," he said quietly, using her childhood nickname. "What are you doing here?" "My job," she replied, fighting back tears as she began examining his injuries. "How bad is it?" shrapnel in the shoulder, and a knock on the head from a shell blast, James explained. I can walk, but my arm's pretty useless right now. The other guys are hurt worse than me. Margaret quickly assessed all 7 soldiers, prioritizing their medical needs for transportation. 2 men had severe injuries that required immediate attention, one with a bullet wound in his abdomen and another with a badly mangled leg from an explosion. The others had various combinations of cuts, burns, and broken bones that were painful but not life-threatening. The most critically wounded soldier was Private Danny Morrison, a 19-year-old from Texas who had been shot in the stomach during the fighting that stranded the group behind enemy lines. He was conscious but pale from blood loss, and Margaret knew he needed surgery as soon as possible. How long have you been here? Margaret asked the squad leader, Sergeant William Parker, as she worked on stabilizing Private Morrison. For days, Sergeant Parker replied. We were supposed to be relieved after taking this position, but the Germans counterattacked before reinforcements arrived. We've been living on field rations and hoping someone would come for us. Margaret and Betty worked quickly to prepare the wounded soldiers for transport. The 2 most seriously injured men would require careful handling during the journey, and all 7 soldiers were weak from several days of limited food and water. As they loaded the last patient into the ambulances, Margaret heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of vehicles approaching from the east. Betty Rodriguez heard it too, and immediately began preparing for a hasty departure. German patrol, Betty whispered urgently. We need to leave now. Margaret was still inside the farmhouse gathering medical supplies when she heard Betty's engine start up outside. Through a crack in the boarded windows, she could see headlights approaching across the fields. The German patrol was less than half a mile away and closing fast. She ran to her ambulance, where James and 2 other wounded soldiers were waiting. Private Morrison was unconscious on a stretcher in the back, and his condition was deteriorating rapidly. Can you drive? Margaret asked James quickly. With one arm? Probably not safely, especially with wounded men in back, he replied. Margaret made a split-second decision that would define the rest of the mission. Instead of following Betty's ambulance directly back toward American lines, she turned north, heading toward a route she remembered from earlier reconnaissance missions. It was longer and more dangerous, but it would take them away from the approaching German patrol. The drive that followed was the most harrowing experience of Margaret's life. She drove through forests and farmland in complete darkness, navigating by memory and instinct while constantly checking on her patients. Private Morrison's breathing became increasingly labored, and Margaret knew she was racing against time to get him to a surgeon. Twice during the journey, Margaret had to stop and provide medical treatment that went far beyond her training as an ambulance driver. When Private Morrison began bleeding internally, she had to start an intravenous line and administer emergency medications while parked in a muddy field. When another soldier went into shock from his injuries, she used techniques she had learned by watching doctors at the base hospital. You're not just an ambulance driver, James observed as Margaret worked to stabilize their most critical patient. When did you learn to do all this? I learned by watching and asking questions, Margaret replied without stopping her work. When you care about keeping people alive, you find ways to acquire the skills you need. The journey back to American lines took nearly 6 hours instead of the planned 2 hours. Margaret had to navigate around German positions, wait for patrols to pass, and take detours through difficult terrain that tested both her driving skills and her ambulance's mechanical reliability. As dawn approached, Margaret finally saw the American positions ahead. She was exhausted, low on fuel, and desperate to get her patients to proper medical care. Private Morrison had survived the journey, but barely, and would need immediate surgery to have any chance of recovery. The reception at the base hospital was unlike anything Margaret had experienced before. Word of the rescue mission had spread throughout the medical corps, and doctors, nurses, and other drivers were waiting to help unload the wounded soldiers. Captain Chen personally supervised the transfer of patients to the operating rooms. All 7 soldiers are alive, Captain Chun reported to Margaret after the initial medical evaluations were complete. Private Morrison is in surgery, but the doctors are optimistic. Your field medical treatment during transport probably saved his life. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. The mission had been successful, but, more importantly, she had discovered capabilities within herself that went far beyond her role as an ambulance driver. She had functioned as a battlefield medic, a navigator, a tactical decision-maker, and a leader under extreme pressure. Over the following weeks, as the rescued soldiers recovered from their injuries, Margaret's reputation within the medical corps continued to grow. Other drivers sought her advice on complex rescue scenarios. Medical officers consulted her about improving protocols for treating patients during transport. Military commanders requested her input on planning missions that required ambulance support. Captain Chun called Margaret to his office 3 weeks after the rescue mission. On his desk were several official documents that would change her status within the medical corps. The Army has decided to create a new position, he explained. Senior Rescue Specialist. It's designed for ambulance drivers who have demonstrated exceptional skills in complex rescue operations. The job would involve training other drivers, planning difficult missions, and serving as a medical advisor for operations behind enemy lines. Margaret studied the documents carefully. The new position would mean more responsibility, higher pay, and recognition for the skills she had developed. More importantly, it would allow her to help other drivers develop the capabilities needed to save lives in the most challenging circumstances. There's one condition, Captain Chun continued. The position requires you to extend your service commitment by 1 year. You'd be staying in France longer than originally planned. Margaret thought about her family back home in Ohio. Her father was managing the farm alone, and her younger siblings missed her terribly. But she also thought about all the wounded soldiers who still needed help, and the drivers who could benefit from the training and leadership she could provide. I accept, she said without hesitation. 6 months later, Margaret Sullivan had become one of the most respected figures in the American Medical Corps. She had trained dozens of new drivers, participated in 17 major rescue missions, and developed new protocols for treating patients during transport that were being adopted throughout the military medical system. Her reputation extended beyond the American forces. British and French medical officers sought her advice on rescue operations, and she had been decorated by 3 different countries for her service. More importantly, the soldiers she had rescued and trained were carrying her lessons forward, creating a ripple effect of improved medical care throughout the war zone. But Margaret's proudest moment came when she received a letter from Private Danny Morrison, the soldier she had saved during the farmhouse rescue. He had recovered completely from his wounds and was being sent home to Texas to marry his sweetheart before returning to civilian life. You didn't just save my life, he wrote. You showed me what it means to never give up, even when everything seems hopeless. I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life, and I'll make sure my children know about the ambulance driver who became a hero by simply caring enough to do whatever was necessary. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in her footlocker next to similar messages from other soldiers she had helped. She had come to France as a simple ambulance driver from a small farming town in Ohio. Through determination, courage, and an unwillingness to accept limitations, she had become something much more, a leader, a teacher, and a symbol of what ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to let circumstances define their capabilities. As she prepared for another rescue mission that evening, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed since that first nervous drive to an aid station months earlier. She was no longer just someone who drove wounded soldiers from one place to another. She had become someone who saved lives through knowledge, skill, and an unshakable commitment to helping others survive the worst circumstances imaginable. The war would eventually end, and Margaret would return home to Ohio. But the lessons she had learned and taught in France would continue to influence military medical care for generations to come. She had proven that expertise and leadership can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important heroes are those who simply refuse to accept that someone else's life is beyond saving. Margaret Sullivan had shocked everyone on the battlefield not through dramatic acts of violence or traditional displays of military prowess, but through quiet competence, unwavering determination, and an extraordinary commitment to preserving life in the midst of death. She had redefined what it meant to be an ambulance driver, and in doing so, had redefined what it meant to be a hero.